There we go. Welcome everybody to the Potomac River Jazz Club's October Jazz Talk. We are always excited to have Dave Sager talking with us, and tonight we will learn more about Buddy Bolden, which is always an interesting topic. A couple of things. Number one, thank you so much to Rob Bamberger and to Roland Aschenbein for your support of sponsoring tonight's talk, and also to everybody else who, bought donation tickets, because that keeps our program going. If you're not familiar with us, we are a small jazz club in the Washington, D.C. area, and any little bit helps bolster the budget and keep getting great speakers like we have this evening. So most of you know Dave or know about Dave, but he's a jazz historian. He's a trombonist, a Grammy-nominated writer, and a reference assistant in the Library of Congress's Recorded Sound Research Center. If you are in the DC area, you could catch him playing at our monthly concert, which is this Sunday, the Miss Maybell concert, and around here and there otherwise. So I'm going to turn everything over to Dave. And just a reminder again, at the end, he will address questions, and you are welcome to unmute and turn your video on and have a little conversation going. But until then, we're going to keep all of those mics muted and all of those videos off. All right, Dave, handing it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Ellie. I'll share my screen in a minute. Thank you. And thank you to the sponsors. This better be good. Otherwise, I'll feel compelled to send your tuition back. Anyway, this is a really fun topic and presentation for me, because the subject, Charles Buddy Bolden, always enlivens the imagination and invites creative speculation. And there'll be a lot of speculation going on tonight. I'm going to share my screen. Wait a second. Not quite there yet. Just a moment. See, this was something I meant to have prepared ahead of time. Okay. Now, back to the screen sharing. Zoom, share. Okay, let's see. You should all see my title card. Is that, Ellie, is that showing?
Yep, it's definitely showing, and you probably already did the share audio, but just a quick reminder on that.
Yeah, well, I haven't, wait a second. Let's do this again. No, share sound. Good. Okay. We're ready to roll, folks. It's nearly impossible to talk about Buddy Bolden without invoking myth and exaggerations. And the reasons are obvious. And my PowerPoint isn't obvious. There we go. Bolden was an African-American cornetist in the early 20th century in New Orleans. He was a real person, and he played with a passionate and supposedly very hot style, an embryonic version of what became later known as jazz. And he's considered to be the first ever to combine dance music with elements of blues and ragtime. We know a lot about his life, and we know something about his repertoire and style of playing, but we really don't know what he and his band truly sounded like, which is really convenient for somebody in my position, because I can tell you just about anything. You won't necessarily believe me. But over the years, the tall tales about Bolden have, no matter how much jazz scholarship has tried to thwart them, they just keep coming back, and sometimes they get even taller. And I think it's important to remember that jazz and mythology are good friends. Jazz musicians such as Bolden have been portrayed over decades as part rascal, part prophet, part devil, part saint. And from what we know about Bolden, he epitomizes these contradictions in all of their inferences. We're told that the band played blues-drenched melodies, very hot melodies, that sent their audiences into hysteria and ecstasy, not unlike what could be found in the Baptist church, somewhat akin to voodoo, it's been said. We can picture that audience, a sweating mass of dancing humanity, prostitutes, pimps, and their neighbors who gathered at places like the Union Sons Hall, which was located on Rampart Street near Perdido. It was at this hall that the band created a sensation with their raucous rendition of Funky Butt, a musical tribute to the foul odor in the place. And the Union Sons Hall would soon become known as Funky Butt Hall. Another story tells us how Bolden, from his bandstand at Johnson Park, uptown New Orleans, used his loudness, sheer loudness, to steal audiences from the competing orchestra across the ways in the adjacent park, from a reading orchestra, polite dance orchestra led by John Robichaux, who was a very popular orchestra leader in New Orleans at the time. Bolden did make a cylinder recording with his band sometime between 1895 and 1905. Jazz historians have searched for years trying to, a little premature there, trying to find this recording, and to no avail for decades. And this is what gave me the idea for the rather snarky title for this presentation, because the idea of Bolden having an album of greatest hits is absurd. That missing cylinder adds another layer of mystique to Bolden's legend. If only we could hear it. And another thing that makes Bolden mysterious to us is that he spent such a brief time on the scene, around 1898 and then ending in 1906. He was institutionalized in 1907 for his drunken behavior and violent outbreaks. And he was sent to the Louisiana State Insane Asylum at Jackson, Louisiana, where he frittered away 24 years before he died in November of 1931. And by the late 1930s, with the advent of the book Jazzmen, pulled up a late edition of it, which is one of the first histories of jazz. By that time in the late 30s, Bolden had become kind of a folk hero to jazz historians who gathered these stories from people who knew him or from people who were around New Orleans at the time. Many of them are inaccurate, and they help spring to life and keep alive those tall tales, such as Bolden was a barber and edited a scandal sheet called The Cricket, etc. They keep Bolden into a bit of a Paul Bunyan. My goal here is to peel away enough of this myth and to help steer our imagination in a direction that provides clarity. In part, I'm going to ask you all to conflate some of the sounds I will share in the next hour and try to layer them in your minds to come up with a kind of police composite image of Bolden and his band. And remember to keep those tall tales in mind. They have a way of pulling us in and transporting us to a place, pardon this cliche, folks, long ago and far away. Here's an etching of Buddy Bolden from the mid-1890s, supposedly. And this is one of two images that we know of Bolden. He was born on September the 6th, 1877, to Alice and Westmore Bolden. Westmore was a drayman, and he died when Charlie, or Buddy, was just a child. While in his teens, Buddy learned the cornet from his mother's boyfriend, a man named Manuel Hall. Buddy formed his own band in the late 1890s. And according to the pianist and teacher Manuel Mineta, who both knew and worked with Bolden, Buddy could indeed read music, and as could several other members of his band. It makes sense that Buddy could read, or supposedly could read, because he received some kind of formal training, though doubt exists, and oral histories from others who knew Bolden or were around when he played said he couldn't read a note as big as a house. His contemporaries recalled that he played in a loud, rough manner and could be heard miles away from where he was playing. That's what I mean. And it's that miles away that kind of gets our attention, catches us off guard, because it's the kind of thing that the early chroniclers of jazz, like the people who wrote Jazzmen, loved to latch upon. And it propagated many of the tall tales, such as, I'm quoting from Jazzmen, when Buddy Bolden played in the Pecan Grove over in Gretna, he could be heard across the river throughout uptown New Orleans. We'll talk about that. Buddy Bolden played a cornet, which was the shorter, fatter, third cousin once removed on its mother's side to the trumpet. The reason for the fact that it's such a distant relative is because the trumpet and the cornet were descended from different families. Here's a picture of a Con Wonder from the early 1900s, which I don't remember the source, but we have learned that Buddy Bolden played a Con Wonder at some point during his short career. It came with all kinds of accoutrements. But the trumpet was descended from a largely cylindrical bamboo, ancient bamboo, not cylindrical, cylindrical bamboo instrument that eventually became made out of copper or whatever they were smelting back in the 11th century. Yes, the trumpet was a largely cylindrical bore with a flared bell, and the trumpet's role was annunciatory. That is, it provided triumphant sounding flourishes. And even in the late 19th and early 20th century band music, you can still see trumpet parts and cornet parts. The difference? That's coming up. The cornet came from the animal horn, such as the ram's horn. Like such a horn, it had a graduated bore and was more suited to lyrical melodic styles of playing. In other words, rule of thumb, cornets were meant to sing, trumpets were meant to trumpet. Being a lyrical instrument, the cornet was not meant to blast upon, which is what I imagine Bolden did. When it's played too loudly, the sound becomes coarse, even ugly. Manuel Mineta said Bolden had a loud, quote, blasting tone. I found an interesting quote, rather humorous quote, in a music trade journal from January of 1898 called The Dominant by one H. Clay Weisham, who is complaining that too many amateurs were taking up the cornet, and this is not an instrument for amateurs. And in part, he said, there is scarcely an instrument less adapted for the amateur's purpose, that is, for home music, than the cornet, being as it is noisy, blaring, coarse in tone, and an unmitigated nuisance in a house and to the neighbors. Thank you, Mr. Weisham. But in that era and through the early 1900s, the cornet was the king of brass instruments. Every kid wanted to play one. There were so many famous cornet soloists traveling with the famous concert bands like Sousa's band, Patrick Gilmore's band, the great Creator, forgive me, Meredith Willson, and the most famous of all was this gentleman, a British Jew named Jules Levy, was born in 1838, died in 1903. Levy, by the late 1870s, maybe a little earlier, was the most famous musician, living musician in the world. A little exact, one of the most famous living musicians in the world. He was certainly a superstar. He had a huge ego. He was loud and bumptious, and like all good cornet virtuosos should be. Levy recorded, and he recorded the typical kinds of fare that you would find these soloists such as he and Herbert L. Clark and Walter B. Rogers playing at the concerts with bands like Sousa's, etc. Usually they would play a number that was a theme and variation with these dazzling technical variations, technical displays that would wow the audience. And then as an encore, they would be followed with a simple sentimental song or a simple tune. We're going to hear two brief excerpts, one from 1901 and one from 1903, shortly before Levy's death, of Levy playing his own composition, Our Own Make Polka, and a song called The Tale of the Bumblebee, which he didn't compose, but it was from a current Broadway show called King Dodo. I'm not kidding you. And here's Jules Levy. They said Bolden could be heard miles away from where he was playing, of course. Jules Levy could probably be heard a long ways too, but having the training he did, you can be assured that he was not a blaster. Again, that was very difficult to avoid when playing loudly on the cornet. Specifically, it was said that Bolden, when playing at the Globe Hall, which is located on the New Basin near where, which is no longer a basin, but which is now Basin Street, right about where Municipal Auditorium stands today. When he was playing there, he could be heard all the way down here at the Canal Street Ferry in Algiers. So here's where Bolden would be playing at Globe Hall. Oops, sorry. And this is a distance of about 2 miles. And as you can see, a good bit of that is over water, and sound carries well over water. And the rest of it through the French Quarter with these buildings so close together, sound ricocheting everywhere. But also remember, it was very humid, and all that humidity in the air probably helped that sound travel as well. So it is completely plausible that he could have been heard that distance, especially in those days when it was very quiet. There were no automobiles, no boom boxes, etc. Manuel Mineta claimed, I already said it, pardon me. On to the next slide. According to Manuel Mineta, there we go, Bolden's style was mostly straight, except when he played blues and tunes such as Make Me a Pallet on the Floor. By straight, I think he meant Bolden played mostly a straight melody, either read as well as Bolden could read off of a piece of music or remembered. But when he played these blues numbers, it was a totally different story. Humphrey Lyttelton, a British cornetist and trumpeter and band leader, participated in recording a marvelous documentary for the BBC back in the 1980s called King Bolden. And he recruited a band and instructed them as to how he wanted them to play to sound like Bolden's band. And we're going to hear a little excerpt of Humphrey Lyttelton doing his best to make us think that we're standing somewhere away from Globe Hall listening to Buddy Bolden. Another myth about Bolden is that he played jazz in this recognizable way. Lyttelton's concept, I think, is appropriately rough, but I think it's a bit too informed by what he knew as jazz, which he started listening to jazz probably in the 1930s or 40s. But he apparently chose to conjure up cornetist Freddie Keppard, who, according to several of Bolden's contemporaries, sounded a good bit like Bolden. Now, that's maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 people, I think, who went on record to say that, and probably responding to some leading questions. But Keppard played loud, he played rough, and I'm sure blasted a good bit. Here is an excerpt from a 1926 recording featuring Fred Keppard. Freddie Keppard, here comes the hot tamale man. I would like to think that Lyttelton's approach is the correct one because that's the one I like the most. But I don't think that is quite what we would have gotten from Buddy Bolden. But more about that as we go along. A little digression here. We're going to play with some different versions of the tune Careless Love, excerpts of various recordings. One beginning with Humphrey Lyttelton and his band from the same Bolden documentary, but then from 2 trumpet players / cornet players who knew Bolden. One who claimed to play with him, and that is Bunk Johnson. And most recently, a lot of the things that we believe about Bunk Johnson mainly was that he lied about everything when he was born, who he played with. According to information that is recently, maybe better part of a decade ago, gleaned from the Fred Ramsey collection. Fred Ramsey was one of the authors of the book Jasmine. Apparently, Bolden's trombonist, valve trombonist, Willie Cornish, told Charles Edward Smith that Bunk Johnson did indeed play with Bolden. Anyway, there's a very interesting book by an Australian researcher named Vic Hobson called Creating Jazz Counterpoint. And it has some fascinating details in there about Bolden and Bunk Johnson, and addresses a lot of these things that we've been unsure about for so many years. So we're going to hear Bunk Johnson play a bit of Careless Love. Following that, we'll hear Wooden Joe Nicholas also playing a chorus of Careless Love. Wooden Joe heard Bolden many times when he was Nicholas was a teenager, and idolized him, and eventually learned to play the trumpet, saying that he wanted to emulate Bolden. How representative this recording is, I'm not sure, but food for thought. Here's Humphrey Littleton. I also want to remind anybody who has their video, please turn your video off for right now, because it really will help the reception. Here's Bunk Johnson. And now Wooden Joe Nicholas. Now, if I had to pick a trumpet player or a cornet player whom I thought was a good representation of Buddy Bolden, I would probably pick this next person, an unknown cornetist who was part of a band that accompanied a preacher named Professor Hull, who recorded for Decca in 1935. And we'll hear a little bit of this unknown gentleman right now. Funky Butt was supposedly Buddy Bolden's theme song. It eventually became known as Buddy Bolden's Blues, or I Thought I Heard Buddy Bolden Say, and it shares a melody with one strain of a ragtime piece called St. Louis Tickle, which was published in 1904. Which came first? My suspicion is the melody that is called Funky Butt was around for a long time, dating back to Reconstruction times, and had lyrics that referred to General Sherman and General Lee and General Grant and General Electric and all the generals. And supposedly it was even considered, there was an ordinance or something like an ordinance in New Orleans because people were often singing it in public and making fun of the political situations, and it got tiresome to certain members of the population. I don't know how true that is. One of our guests, when we talk a little later, might be able to clear that up. Again, we're going to hear from Humphrey Littleton. And it's very interesting here. If you're familiar with the song, you may remember that it begins with a phrase that descends in half steps. Pardon me. Which is how it comes to us from St. Louis Tickle, and I Thought I Heard Buddy Bolden Say from Jelly Roll Morton. But Littleton very cleverly, I think, chose to play it a little bit different. Instead of da 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 da, he plays da 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 da. He goes down a whole step from the first note instead of descending in half steps. And I didn't sing that very well. I'll let him play it for you. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Professor Hancock, if not by Professor, by Colin Hancock, who is a really wonderful musician, spectacular, dogged researcher, and just a really incredible dynamo of creativity. And back in 2015, when he was still in high school, Colin undertook a project whereby he assembled a group with the personnel of Bolden's, not the personnel, excuse me, the instrumentation of Bolden's band, and recorded that group after kind of grooming them in the style that he wanted, recorded them onto cylinders. That's another one of Colin's hobbies, is to go around recording people on cylinder phonographs. And this is a recording of the live version of Buddy Bolden's Blues, or Funky Butt, that they played. There's also a cylinder version too, which I don't think I have at the moment. So, can I really answer this question? Probably not, but I've thought about it a lot. I want to comment on Humphrey Littleton's use of his ensemble. If you can recall those excerpts I played previous, the trombone player definitely playing a valve trombone, and the clarinetists. Uh, Everybody seems to be playing in not just an archaic, but a primitive kind of way that I think predates any kind of jazz and predates just about any kind of music. And I think I have an excerpt here to remind us of what that sounded like. It was like he just gathered anybody from the street and got them good and liquored up and handed them instruments and said, here, play. But back to the question. What did Bolden's band sound like? The word band, the use of band is kind of an interesting thing because back in those days, there were different understandings of the various types of ensemble. A band usually meant a military style or concert band, like Sousa's band or Gilmour's band or the Great Creator, um, brass, woodwinds, and percussion. And there were also brass bands. You hear a lot about brass bands and when we read about or hear about or talk about New Orleans jazz, early New Orleans jazz. Brass bands originally were made up of conical brass instruments, that is cornet, euphoniums, alto horns, tenor horns, and percussion, no woodwinds. And they in New Orleans, they pretty much carried on the tradition of no woodwinds until the saxophone started to take over from the alto and tenor horns. And then there were dance orchestras, which were ensembles that frequently had violins and a couple of clarinets, a couple of cornets. We're going to look into that in just a moment. I think the early jazz bands were based mostly on the typical types of dance orchestras that were around. And one thing that kind of I find very interesting and worth looking into, although I'm not sure where to look, was that the dance orchestras had a more flexible afterbeat. And we'll hear some examples of that in a little bit. In the marching band or a brass band, it is those horns, those alto and tenor horns, or the French horns that play an afterbeat and create kind of a percussive bop, 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 bop. In an orchestra, the afterbeat was played by viola or by the right hand of the piano. It was softer and it had more rebound. And I think that lent itself more to a sense of, if you will, swing, if I can use that word. Another point I wanted to make is even if the musicians did not read music in these pre-jazz bands, they still imitated the standardized roles of their respective instruments, the roles that were defined in music for dance orchestra. Here's a typical orchestration, a little bit later than Bolden's time. This is from 1910, but the instrumentation would be the same as an earlier piece. And we can see there's violins, first and second cornet, clarinet, flute and piccolo, trombone, cello. There were viola parts, which I don't have here, piano, bass, and drums. And these orchestrations were widely available and were, for, as we just saw, a large complement of instruments. And they were designed to work with just about any combination that you had, as long as you had somebody playing a melody, somebody playing a harmony, somebody providing some kind of rhythmic support. And they were very easily acquired. The music stores carried them. They weren't very expensive, and you could get them free if you were an established orchestra leader. Here's a picture of the very orchestra that Buddy Bolden stole the audience away from. John Robichaux led a typical dance orchestra of the time, and we see that there's first and second cornet, first and second violin, trombone, clarinet, bass, and drums. They didn't have a cello, at least not in this picture, but the trombone player would have no doubt gravitated to a cello part because it was a much more interesting part than the trombone parts generally were, and in the same range. And here is a cornet part, first cornet part, and the first violin part from St. Louis Tickle, the piece that is similar in one strain to Funky Butt or Buddy Bolden's Blues. And it's interesting to note here, and we're going to hear a little excerpt of a recording of this in just a moment. The melody played here on the violin, da 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 da, etc. And the cornet part, the cornets didn't necessarily play the melody in those days. They played some melody, at least in these arrangements. And then they would have background figures, harmony, and rhythm. Here, the cornet has the melody for just a couple measures and then comes back in with a supportive part. We're going to hear a recording, an excerpt of a recording from around 1905 by Charles Prince's orchestra of St. Louis Tickle. So, the instrumentation of Bolden's band is not unlike that of John Robichaux's. One cornet, two clarinets. Why two clarinets? One of them would probably have played, and I think it's pretty likely, and probably this gentleman right here would have played the violin part. And I can tell that this clarinet is longer than that clarinet. It's probably, no, excuse me. It would have been this guy. The shorter clarinet would have been playing a C clarinet who could read the right off of the music, right off of the violin part, because the clarinet is a transposing instrument. Anyway, I'll try to get out of that mess. So what bands like Bolden's band would have done would have been to pick out the parts from the orchestrations they wanted, and whoever could read would teach the others their parts, or they would muddle through it as best as they can. And instead of the piano, you had a guitar. So now, the Bolden band photo, I can't get away without talking about that for a second. This is the way it first appeared in the book Jazzman in 1939. Willie Cornish provided his copy of the photograph, and it was borrowed and copied, and I believe never returned to him, or if it was returned, it was lost. People notice that the instrumentalists are holding their instruments backwards in some cases. And this arrangement is thought to be correct. However, let's see, I always get this wrong. Da, 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 da. So here, Bolden's lead pipe is on the wrong side of the cornet. Holding it up to his face, it would have to be on the right side. And here it is anatomically correct. I think so. I hope I don't have that reversed. The story has been somewhat solved. The picture is a tintype, which printed out in reverse. It was almost like an instant photo. It was developed. The photographer then would present the person who was posing with a copy, and it would be backwards. And in order to mitigate that, oftentimes the photographer asked the musicians, if there were musicians, or to hold their instruments the other way so that it would look correct. There's a very interesting article in the Two-Lane Jazz Archivist by Clive Wilson and Justin Winston about it. If you go on to the Music Rising site, I think you can, or the Two-Lane archive site, you can download and read all the issues of the Jazz Archivists. Bolden's band played all kinds of material. They didn't play just blues and hot numbers. They played two-steps, such as the 6/8 two-step, like El Capitan. I don't know if they actually played El Capitan, but they certainly could have, and it wouldn't surprise me in the least. They played quadrilles, they played waltzes, they played all kinds of different jobs, different repertoire at their different jobs, depending on what the audiences wanted to hear. I'm going to play you an excerpt of El Capitan, recorded in 1901. This is very interesting. This is by the Victor Record Company's Metropolitan Orchestra, which is, similarly to Bolden, a stripped-down dance orchestra. And instead of a violin playing the violin part, they used a clarinet. Now, they don't use a guitar, they use a piano, and there's a flute, and there's a couple of other things which would not pass for Bolden's band, but this would give us an idea about the texture, the timbre of that ensemble. But first, before we do that, remember how I said that the military bands had more of a percussive afterbeat, not as flexible as that of the dance orchestras. Here is El Capitan, played by Sousa's band in 1908. Okay, now we're going to hear the Metropolitan Orchestra from 1901, definitely during Bolden's heyday. And you'll notice in the little spaces like here, ba-dum, 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 and these little rests here, you can hear the piano playing this rather springy afterbeat. It's kind of nice. I don't expect everyone to pick that up the first time, so I'm going to back it up. I'm going to play that for you again. Now, in 1999, a very fine cornet player, jazz cornet player named Mark Caparone in California put together a band with the same personnel as we see in the Bolden photo and played songs that pieces rather, or songs that he thought Bolden either played or could have very well played, such as El Capitan. And let's compare that to what we just heard. We'll hear more from the Imperial Serenaders later and more from Professor Hancock's orchestra. But first, let's talk about the cylinder. And I think it's important to know what to expect when we hear a cylinder recording, particularly one that was made at the turn of the last century, and particularly if it was made by an amateur, that is, an amateur recordist. If you had a cylinder phonograph, you could make your own records. It came with a reproducing head called a reproducer or a speaker, and it also came with a recorder, and could also come with a supply of wax blanks, which is what we see here. And it was a very popular pastime, and something people like to do when they had dinner parties or whatever is to make records of their guests or their children playing their instruments or singing and what have you. Cylinders were very popular from the late 1880s up until around 1908 or 1909. I'm sure there are folks here who will correct me or adjust what I had to say. And for a good bit of that time, actually for all of that time, they were in competition with the disc record. So people say cylinders came before disc. Well, they really didn't. They were on the scene at the same time. Now, it is known that there was a particular gentleman from uptown New Orleans who recorded Bolden, and this is where I got to thank Dan Meyer, because he was the first one to tell me about Oscar Zahn, who was a German immigrant, a grocer and saloon keeper, and an avid phonograph recordist. And he is the person who recorded Bolden. It has been substantiated. And here's another picture. This is Oscar Zahn's bar room around the time Bolden was institutionalized. I'm not sure if that is Zahn or his brother. I knew at one time Dan Meyer might be able to correct me. And if you look over here, here's a record player, a disc record player, a gramophone as opposed to a phonograph, but still, that's kind of interesting. And I want to play for you now an excerpt of a homemade cylinder from around 1898 of a piece of ragtime. What more perfect example we could find if we're thinking about trying to conjure up Buddy Bolden, except this is a recording of a brass band, and it's the Soldiers Home Band of Bath, New York, recorded around 1898, and they're playing the Mississippi Rag.
The Mississippi Rag, played by the Soldiers Home Band of Bath, New York.
And if you notice the afterbeats or the upbeats on that recording, they're not exactly like the guitar or piano we heard earlier, more like what we'd hear in a band. But man, it sure was sprightly, wasn't it? So we're going to go back to Careless Love, as I promised, and Professor Hancock's orchestra. And this is one of Colin's cylinder recordings made back in all the way back in 2015 when Colin was in high school. And it's this is the like I said, the actual cylinder playback of that recording of his Buddy Bolden Recreation Orchestra. And very interesting to pay attention to the use of the instruments because it's much more sophisticated than what we heard out of the Humphrey Littleton band earlier. I particularly like the way the clarinets take up the melody, one playing a lead and the other one playing an obligato, more like a typical clarinet part. I'm going to play the whole 2 minutes and some seconds cylinder of Careless Love. Let you all get your ears used to the sound of this. It's a little distant.
Professor Hancock's orchestra will play Careless Love.
Now, what about Bolden cylinder? We know about Oscar Zahn. And we also know that Oscar Zahn and his descendants kept his cylinders in a storage shed in the backyard of the Zahn residence in New Orleans. I can't remember the exact details, and it was written up in the second edition of Don Marquis' In Search of Buddy Bolden. This is the first edition, but Zahn's granddaughter, I think it was, a couple of relatives surfaced who I think were the ones who revealed that it was Oscar who knew Bolden and recorded him. And they said, no, Oscar's cylinders were in that storage shed, and they were kept in the heat and humidity in New Orleans summers for decades, and that storage shed was eventually torn down and everything was thrown out. So I don't think there'll ever be a chance of finding the Buddy Bolden recording. However, there's good news because I still have a few more things to play for you. We're going to hear a couple more recorded excerpts. One, an actual cylinder of this piece, My Ragtime Baby, which was composed by Fred S. Stone, who is a Black musician who worked for Finney's Orchestra of Detroit in the late 19th century. And it was recorded quite a number of times. This is an excerpt from a 1902 recording of My Ragtime Baby. And then we're going to follow that with a similarly edited excerpt by the Imperial Serenaders, whom we heard earlier, led by cornetist Mark Caparone. First, the Peerless Orchestra.
My Ragtime Baby, played by the Peerless Orchestra, Edison Records.
a very interesting and convincing, I think, realization of how Bolden's band may have played that work. I love the guitar. I think that's Craig Van Tresco on the guitar. And Mark Caperone's ride out on the cornet, that last strain is also kind of harkening back to the Freddie Keppard idea. Speaking of Freddie Keppard, whom we heard from earlier, and to remind you, he played loudly, rhythmically, and with a rough edge. He also left behind a large number of phonograph recordings, not a copious amount, but a good amount, enough to give us an idea of his particular style. And amazingly, Keppard is foreshadowed in several dozen recordings made during the first decade and a half of the 20th century by a cornetist not from New Orleans, but from another port city located about 670 miles southeast across the Gulf of Mexico, and that is Pablo Valenzuela, who was born well before Buddy Bolden was born. Didn't quite make it to 1931 when Bolden died, but Valenzuela recorded copiously in the early 1900s, from around 1901 or 2. And they share some very interesting stylistic traits, let's say. We're going to hear Keppard again with Here Comes the Hot Tamale Man, but not the version we heard earlier. This is with Doc Cook's orchestra, the full orchestra, not the combo. And then we're going to follow that with a piece called Amalia Molina, recorded in 1909 by Pablo Valenzuela, just a couple of years after Bolden was institutionalized. But Valenzuela's style is consistent here in 1909 as it was several years earlier. Here's Freddie Keppard. I love the way Keppard just sort of arches out over the orchestra, kind of jumps up and out of nowhere and dominates. Incidentally, as in the earlier version of this tune, the exhortation towards the end is, in case you didn't pick it up, fire truck, red hot, that's what. Here is Pablo Valenzuela approaching in a very similar way, I think, to Mr. Keppard. the facts of Buddy Bolden's life have been largely clarified, and the nature of his music somewhat clarified, he largely remains a mystery, musically, that is. However, the existing evidence, although fragmentary, is largely consistent. There is much to deduce from written and recorded testimony, old orchestrations, and phonograph records to create something akin to that police facial composite we referred to earlier. Still, with that sketch in our hands, it remains guesswork. We'll never really know. And I would like to acknowledge these people for their help. David Giovannoni, who provided excerpts, or actually provided recordings found on his website, i78s.org. If you're not a member, it's free. You just need a passcode. It's one of the best things since sliced bread and the Zoom call. i78s.org. Colin Hancock for access to his Buddy Bolden recordings and his valuable advice. Michael Kiefer, who provided a different recording of Pablo Valenzuela, not the one I ended up choosing, but he went out of his way to get that to me. And also Rich Martin and Megan Hennessy of Archaeophone Records, who provided access to the Mississippi Rag, played by the Soldiers Home of Bath, New York. So I think we can open it up. I can stop sharing because I think I can rest my voice a little bit right now.
Thanks so much, Dave. This has been great. I'm going to bring up a question that popped up in the chat. This would have been before your slide on the cylinder. You mentioned somebody named Mark, and somebody asked for Mark's full name.
That was Mark Caparone, I think is how it's pronounced. But the CD, which you can probably find on eBay or Discogs, is on the Stomp Off label called Music of the Bolden Era. And it's very good.
Excellent. Anybody else have any questions? Questions, comments, conversation? Bring it on. We got another.
I'll ask one.
Oh, go ahead, Dave. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Dave, this was wonderful. This is one of the best I've seen in this whole series that Ellie's been producing since it began. And my question is, I'm just wondering, have you heard Wynton Marsalis's soundtrack to the film Bolden, in which he plays Woe You Heifer and other stuff in a style that is similar to the Humphrey Littleton approach? But I just wondered if you've heard that and what you think of it.
I started to watch the movie Bolden, which is now you can stream for free on Amazon. And to tell you the truth, I had to turn it off, not because of the music. I just found it really bothersome. I don't remember exactly why. I thought the music sounded good, but I really don't remember. Honestly, I don't remember what it sounded like. So I'm sorry to not, I'm not trying to evade the question. That's the truth. So, but I knew somebody was going to ask it.
Was there something specifically about it, Dave, that you noticed?
No, I figured he'd be playing the Littleton recordings, but I wondered if he was also going to play the Marsalis. And so since he didn't, I was just wondering if he's familiar with it.
Yeah, got it. Cool. Thanks for the question. Anyone else? Questions, comments, discussion?
Sure. Yeah, Dan Meyer. Yeah, I can note a couple things. One is that Wooden Joe Nicholas said that Buddy Bolden was the main influence on his playing. Wanted to mention that. And Willie Cornish, the Bolden valve trombone player, had been in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, so I don't know if there's any connection there. And also his memory, he talks about that he recorded with the Bolden band for not a white man, but for a white company, and says he thought it was before he went off to the Spanish-American War. So my guess is that Bolden recorded more than once. That's my, I'm trying to fit together all these stories. There was a cylinder company, the Louisiana Phonograph Company, which almost everything they ever recorded in New Orleans is lost. But okay.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned that. I had read that passage about Cornish, and I meant to say earlier that it's not just one cylinder. I mean, if Zahn recorded them, he probably recorded several cylinders, but certainly, I mean, the technology was around early enough for them to have had several sittings, if not with Mr. Zahn, with others as well. But yeah, I think you've probably looked at those Louisiana Phonograph Company catalogs, or at least I think there's a couple of existing catalogs, and interesting array of things, a lot of recordings by Paoletti's band, and the broader Erasmus sermons, but there's I don't think there's really anything that would lead us in the direction of Bolden, but who knows? We don't know.
Any other questions, comments?
I had a
Um,
Yeah, I had a comment that was interesting when you mentioned Bunk Johnson and how, he turned out to have falsified a lot of things. And I remember reading about this in Don Marquis's book, which is the only book I've read about Buddy Bolden, but I read it many years ago. So if there's a second edition, I'll be interested to know what new stuff is in there. But he was quite sympathetic to why Bunk was doing that. He was afraid of being sent back to the cotton fields. And he was so concerned to sort of build up his reputation because he was coming out of having hit the bottom. So yeah, he was telling falsehoods, but that was the explanation that was given for why he was doing it. Not that it helped us any, because it threw a lot of people off the scent for a long time of what really was going on.
Yeah,
So,
Vic Hobson, who wrote this book I was talking about, Creating Jazz Counterpoint. I mean, he has taken this down to a very granular level,
mhm,
and has just cross-referenced every possible thing he could find, and he did have access to the Fred Ramsey papers, and provides a really sober explanation of why Bolden said he was born in 1879 and not when he was probably born.
mhm.
And it largely had to do with did I say Bolden? Bunk.
Bunk, yeah, Bunk.
Yeah, had to do with Bunk's memory of what happened when.
Mhm,
And Hobson bases his research on when the Robert Charles riots occurred, combined with the memories of the various players involved. But it seems like Bunk was about 6 or 7 years off consistently through all his tales.
mhm,
And then there's the thing about, Willie Cornish himself um, said that, Bunk played with us. It hadn't surfaced. I don't remember if he told that to Fred Ramsey or if he told that to Charles Edward Smith. Cornish wasn't around. I
mhm,
also did not, I wanted to make sure I also mentioned some books by and research by another gentleman in Australia named Daniel Hardy. And this book called The Loudest Trumpet, King Bolden and the Early History of Jazz. Daniel Hardy has done also a lot of really granular research on the era and on Bolden, and also leads his own, I think he calls it the Buddy Bolden Revival Orchestra in Sydney. And they're very good. I didn't have time to include an excerpt from them. This is an ongoing conversation, and I think we need someone else to pick it up and continue the Bolden conversation. I mean, there's certainly more things that I wanted to share.
There's never enough time on these deep dives, I think.
Yeah,
We
that's
could we
right.
could use a couple more hours of for these presentations and get into
Yeah.
this stuff. By the way, I really liked that 1898 Soldiers Home record recording. That was
Yeah, that's a remarkable
yeah.
piece, and
I could just picture them playing it.
Willie Hightower also remembered, he said he spent his youth in the same neighborhood as Funk Johnson and remembered Buddy Bolden going over to pick up young Johnson sometimes when he needed a second cornet on a job.
wow, I never knew that. I didn't know that. Thank you.
Tulane Jazz Archive, Willie Hightower interview.
Well, God, I heard that interview a long time ago. Well, thank you. Thank you for the reminder.
So we're running a little over on time. Let's say maybe one more question and then we're going to wrap it up. Any last minute question, comments?
I have a quick one.
Yes.
Yeah, Dave, you played a sample of, I think you said a series of recordings by Professor Hull's something. It was
Professor Hull's Anthems of Joy.
Anthems of Joy. That's completely new to me. And I'd like to know, is that reissued? Where did you get that?
Oh, that came from Michael Kiefer also. I forgot all about that. He provided that to me years ago. I think there are 4 sides on Decca, or maybe 2 sides on, no, 4 sides, I think, on Decca from 1935. I don't know of a reissue of them. I think I may have the full audio to that, which I can send to you. I don't think Michael would mind.
I'd love to
It's
hear
a
that.
it's a wonderful record. There's great trombone on it, and it's just terrific. And listen, we gotta wrap it up, though. I do want to wave back to Michael Gourier, who was giving me the high five earlier, and I couldn't see his name, but now I can. So glad you're here. And I'm really delighted we had such a good turnout. And
Yeah, fabulous turnout, great information. Everybody was well behaved. I didn't have to constantly mute people. It was beautiful. Everything about it was beautiful.
Can we do a plug in the 30 seconds left to us before they
Oh,
pull the plug?
I was about to do one for the Zooms, and we did one for the concert on Sunday already. What are you plugging?
Oh, you did. I didn't hear the one for the concert on Sunday.
Yeah.
If you like Dave in oral presentation, you'll like him in musical presentation. If you're in the Washington area, you said all that.
I said all of that, yes.
Hey, great.
But you can say it again. It's okay. Extra PR is extra PR.
At David's urging, otherwise known as nudging, Miss Maybelle or Maybelle and Charlie Judkins are coming to perform for the Potomac River Jazz Club in Silver Spring, Maryland this weekend. She wears period clothes. She plays the washboard and the kazoo.
And the guitar and the banjo.
Playing harmony with the kazoo will be David Sager, nonetheless, and Anita Thomas.
Anita, yeah. Great lineup. I'm really looking forward to that myself.
Do come.
Yes. And
Rosenstiel Hall.
Yes, Rosenstiel Hall, and you can learn more about that and all of our upcoming events on our website, PRJC, Potomac River Jazz Club, prjc.org. Our November Jazz Talk, which will be held on Monday the 4th, is going to be by Don Bappy, Banjo Hall of Fame player, and he's going to talk about the contemporary value of early jazz, how some of the influences that early jazz has made all over the place. And that's a good one to maybe invite friends to who aren't super familiar with early jazz, because he's going to tie things in that maybe they'd be more familiar with. And then in December, we have Gunhild Carling doing a presentation on jazz trombones. So we've got some really cool stuff lining up. So again, check us out on prjc.org, and we hope to see you in a future presentation or concert. Thanks so much, Dave. It was absolutely wonderful.
You're welcome.
Always good to have you. Good night,
Thank you
everybody.
all. Thank you all, everybody.